The deed hit the table like a gunshot. Etta Talmadge stood in the doorway of the Harlan County Land Office, the late afternoon sun burning copper behind her, her fingers trembling so badly that the paper rattled against the worn pine surface. She had ridden 14 miles through choking dust to get here. 14 miles of convincing herself she was wrong. 14 miles of telling herself that the name she had spotted on that document, half buried under a stack of survey maps in old Clarence Whitby's office, had been a trick of the light, a smear of ink, anything other than what it actually was. But there it was, filed in September of 1876, clear as a branding iron pressed to hide. Etta Talmadge, sole deed holder, 42 acres on the South Fork of the Cimarron, including the house, the well, the barn, and all structures therein. 7 years. The land office clerk, a pockmarked young man named Duffy who had the permanent expression of a man waiting for bad news, cleared his throat. "Miss Talmadge, who filed this?" Her voice was low and dangerous in a way that surprised even her. She had spent 7 years learning to soften that voice, to smooth it down into something acceptable, something that would not alarm the good people of Harlan County. 7 years of becoming careful. And now the careful woman was gone and the original Etta was standing in her place, and she felt ancient and furious and terrifyingly close to weeping. Duffy looked at his hands. "I am not really at liberty to who filed this deed." The silence in the land office was total. A fly knocked itself against the window glass. Somewhere outside a horse stamped in the heat. "Stephen Abbott," Duffy said finally, "filed it himself, paid the recording fee out of his own pocket." September 14th, 1876. September 14th, 1876. 3 weeks after she had packed what she owned into a single carpetbag and walked off his property in the middle of a thunderstorm, telling herself she would never think his name again. 3 weeks after the worst night of her life. 3 weeks after she had become convinced, absolutely and completely convinced, that Stephen Abbott was the coldest, most calculating, most secretly treacherous man in the entire New Mexico territory. He had waited until she was gone, until she had closed the door on everything she had ever wanted, and then he had put her name on the deed to the land they had built together. 7 years ago. And she had spent all 7 of those years believing he had let her walk. Etta pressed her palm flat against the table to keep herself upright. The paper with her name on it blurred and sharpened, blurred and sharpened. Outside, the wind picked up, pushing a curtain of red dust down the main street of Harlan, rattling the sign above the dry goods store, carrying the smell of horse sweat and distant rain. "Why?" she whispered. Not to Duffy, not to anyone in the room. But the question had been burning a hole in her chest for the past 3 hours, and it was going to keep burning until she got an answer, which meant she was going to have to do the one thing she had promised herself she would never do. She was going to have to ride back out to the Cimarron. She was going to have to face Stephen Abbott. It had been 7 years. A person could change a great deal in 7 years, and Etta Talmadge had changed more than most. She had arrived in Harlan County in the spring of 1875, 23 years old, and running from a life in Kansas that had ground her down to something small and frightened. Her father had gambled away the family homestead, her mother had died of fever the previous winter, and her younger brother James had taken himself west to California with 3 other young men from their county, leaving Etta with nothing but the dress on her back and a carefully hoarded collection of small coins that amounted to $4.60. She had not come west as a mail-order bride. She wanted that made perfectly clear, even if only to herself, even if the telling of it was just a private accounting she kept in the back of her mind. She had come west because the Kansas Pacific Railroad offered reduced fares for women traveling as domestic workers, and because a woman named Mrs. Clara Hobart, who ran the boarding house in Harlan, had placed an advertisement in 3 Kansas newspapers seeking a woman of good character and capable hands to assist with laundry and mending and the general management of a 12-room establishment. Etta had answered the advertisement and she had gotten the position, and she had arrived in Harlan on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and the town had looked simultaneously smaller and more alive than anything she had imagined. There were 2 saloons, a church, a doctor's office, a feed store, a dry goods establishment, a smithy, and approximately 400 people who all seemed to know everything about each other's business, and approximately nothing about the business of anyone who had arrived less than 6 months ago. She had been working at Mrs. Hobart's for about 3 weeks when she first met Stephen Abbott. He had come in looking for a meal, which Mrs. Hobart provided to paying guests between 6 and 8 in the evening, and he had sat down at the long table in the dining room and been perfectly quiet for the first half of the meal, which immediately set him apart from every other man Etta had served. Most of the men who boarded or took meals at Mrs. Hobart's were loud in the particular way that lonely men get loud when they are suddenly around a table of other people. They performed their stories, they talked over each other, they laughed at things that were not especially funny. Stephen Abbott ate his supper with the careful attention of a man who was genuinely hungry but had been raised not to show it, and he thanked Etta twice, once when she poured his coffee, and once when she brought the bread, and both times he actually looked at her when he said it. She had not thought much of it beyond noting that he had dark eyes and that his hands, though clean, bore the particular roughness of real outdoor work. She had seen 100 men with dark eyes and rough hands in Kansas. She was not in the market for noticing men. Then he came back the next Tuesday, and the one after that, and after about a month of this Etta realized that he was timing his trips to town around Mrs. Hobart's supper service, because she had begun to notice that he arrived between 5 and 5:30, which was not enough time to conduct any real business at the feed store or the general merchandise or anywhere else in Harlan, which meant he was coming to town primarily to eat. She asked Mrs. Hobart about him. Clara Hobart was a woman of 50 with sharp gray eyes and the permanent air of a person who has survived a great deal and developed opinions about all of it. She told Etta that Stephen Abbott had come to Harlan County in 1872, that he had purchased a parcel of land on the South Fork of the Cimarron River from a man named Garvey, who had decided the territory was not to his taste, and that he had been building the place up steadily ever since. He ran cattle, maybe 40 head, and he had put in a proper well and a house that people said was better built than most of what existed in town. What he did not have, Mrs. Hobart told her with the particular significance of a woman who knew exactly what she was implying, was a wife. Etta had absorbed this information and said nothing and gone back to work, but after that she found herself paying closer attention to Stephen Abbott on his Tuesday evenings, and what she noticed was that he was quiet in the way that certain men are quiet when they are doing a great deal of thinking, not in the way that men are quiet when they have nothing worth saying. He had opinions when he expressed them, and they were reasonable opinions, and he expressed them without needing the whole table to agree. He was 28 years old, she learned, which meant he was 5 years older than she was, a gap that felt significant and not unpleasant. He had come from Missouri originally, from a farming family outside of Springfield, and he had served briefly in the final years of the war on the Union side, though he did not talk about this in any detail, and she did not press him. By July, she had begun to think about him between his visits, which irritated her considerably, because she had not come to New Mexico Territory to think about men. She had come to New Mexico Territory to build something that was hers, and thinking about men was directly opposed to that goal, because, in her experience of the world, which was admittedly limited but not ignorant, the moment a woman began to think about a specific man was the moment her own plan started to dissolve at the edges. Then Stephen Abbott asked Mrs. Hobart if he might have a word with Etta privately, and Mrs. Hobart, who had a gift for theatrical neutrality, said she supposed that would be all right and left them in the parlor together, though Etta noticed that the parlor door remained open and that Mrs. Hobart did not go very far. What Stephen said, standing hat in hand in Clara Hobart's parlor with the evening light coming through the lace curtains, was not what she expected. He did not make any kind of romantic declaration. He did not tell her she was pretty, though she would not have necessarily objected to hearing it. What he said, after a moment of fairly painful silence, was that he had a proposition for her that he wanted her to consider entirely on its own merits. He said that he had 42 acres on the Cimarron that were good land, better than most people in Harlan understood, because the South Fork had reliable water even in the dry season, and the soil on his portion of the bank was deep and dark. He said that he had been building the place for 3 years and that he had gotten it to the point where he could sustain himself on it, but not much more than that, and that what he needed was not a hired hand but a partner, someone who would share the work and share the decisions and share the results. He said he understood this was an unusual thing to propose to a woman he barely knew, but that he had been watching her for several months, which he acknowledged sounded odd, but meant only that he had observed she was capable and direct, and that she did not waste effort on pretense, and those were qualities he valued in the only kind of partner worth having. Then he said, with the particular deliberateness of a man choosing words very carefully, he was not asking her to marry him. He was asking her to consider whether she might want to come out to the Cimarron and see what the place looked like before she made any kind of decision about anything at all. Etta had looked at him for a long moment and then said she would think about it. She thought about it for 4 days, which was how long it took her to admit to herself that she had already decided. She rode out to his land on a Saturday morning in late August of 1875, and she understood within the first 10 minutes why he had called it good land. The South Fork of the Cimarron came through his property in a clean curve, and the cottonwood trees along the bank were tall and generous, and the grass in the lower meadow was the deep green that meant permanent moisture. The house was a proper structure, not a dugout or a half-built shack, but a 2-room frame house with a covered porch and glass in the windows, and a stone chimney that had been laid with enough skill that it would not fall apart in a hard wind. He showed her the place with a kind of careful restraint, pointing out the practical features without embellishment, letting the land speak for itself. The well was 20 feet deep with good, clean water. There was a kitchen garden that had been allowed to go mostly to weeds for lack of time to tend it, but the soil was clearly rich. The barn held his horses and a milk cow and needed a new roof on the eastern end. He had 12 acres under cultivation with sorghum and had plans to plant winter wheat. She asked him direct questions about the finances, about what he owed and what he owned, and he answered them directly. She asked him what he expected of a partner in terms of daily work, and he described it plainly. She asked him what would happen if, after some period of time, one of them decided the partnership was not working. He was quiet for a moment after that one. Then he said that was a fair question, and he had thought about it, and his answer was that the land would be held jointly, and if either party wished to dissolve the arrangement, the property would be divided or sold, and the proceeds split, and neither person would have any claim on the other beyond that. She asked him if he intended to formalize any of this arrangement. He said he intended to do whatever she felt was right, and then he looked at her in that direct, undecorated way he had, and she understood that the question underneath the question was whether she trusted him enough to begin with nothing more than words, and whether she trusted herself enough to know the difference between a man who was worth trusting and one who was not. She rode back to Mrs. Hobart's that afternoon and gave her notice. She moved to the Cimarron in September of 1875, and within 2 weeks she had taken over the kitchen garden and begun organizing the barn, and established an effective working routine with Stephen Abbott that was productive and occasionally comfortable and almost entirely professional. They were partners. They worked alongside each other from before sunrise to after dark. They ate their meals at the same table. They said good night at the door of the second room, which was hers, and that was where it ended, for about 4 months. The winter of 1875 to 1876 in the New Mexico territory, was hard in the way that the territory specializes in hard, which is to say it did not snow very often, but the cold was a dry, penetrating cold that got into everything, and the wind across the Cimarron plain could strip a person to the bone in minutes. They spent a great deal of time in close quarters, and the close quarters revealed Stephen Abbott to her in ways that the working partnership had not. She learned that he read books, actual books, which he ordered from a catalog out of St. Louis, and which he read in the evenings by lamplight with the focused expression of a man who considered reading a serious activity. She learned that he had a dry, precise sense of humor that announced itself so quietly you could miss it if you were not paying attention, and that once she started paying attention, she found it nearly irresistible. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, and that on the mornings after he was quieter than usual but never cruel about it, never took the darkness of the previous night and redirected it toward her. She also learned, slowly and against her will, that she was in love with him. This realization did not come all at once. It came the way the sun came up over the Cimarron in January, so gradually that by the time you understood it was fully light you could not identify the exact moment when it had stopped being dark. One evening she was aware that she had been watching his hands while he repaired a harness, and that she had been watching them for a long time, and that she was not thinking about harnesses. Another evening she said something that made him laugh, a real laugh, not the polite acknowledgement of humor but the actual involuntary expression of it, and she felt something in her chest that she identified, with considerable alarm, as triumph. She did not tell him any of this. She was not a woman who spoke before she was certain, and she was not certain about what she was feeling, or whether it was wise, or whether it was reciprocated, or what would happen to the partnership if she introduced this particular variable into it. So she said nothing and worked and watched and tried to be rational about it, which was about as successful as being rational about the weather. Then spring came, and with the spring came Harlan County's particular variety of social pressure, which manifested in the form of other people's opinions about the arrangement on the Cimarron. The people of Harlan were not precisely hostile to Etta, but they were curious in the way that small communities become curious when something they cannot categorize is sitting on their edges. A woman living on a man's land, working his farm, sharing his table and apparently nothing else, was a category that Harlan County could not easily resolve. Some people assumed they were married and had simply not announced it. Some people assumed the opposite of marriage was occurring. Some people approached Etta directly and asked her intentions, which was both intrusive and, from the community's perspective, reasonable, since the community's stability depended on its inhabitants occupying recognizable roles. Etta found all of this maddening and mostly ignored it, but she was aware that the pressure existed and that it was building, and she was aware that Stephen must be feeling it too, though he never spoke of it to her. What he spoke of, on a warm evening in April of 1876, when they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the last light go out of the sky over the Cimarron, was the future. He said he had been thinking about the land. He said that what they had built together in the past 7 months was more than he had expected and better than he had hoped, and that he felt something was owed to that. She waited. The river ran quiet and dark below the cottonwoods. He said that what he meant was that her name should be on the deed. She had not expected that. She looked at him, and he was looking at the river, and she could see the particular tension in his jaw that meant he was navigating something carefully. He said that the land was as much hers as his now, and that the deed as it stood put her in a position of dependency that he did not feel was right, and that he intended to go into Harlan and have the deed amended. She said she appreciated the gesture but that it was not necessary. He said it was not a gesture. They did not say much else that night, but something had shifted in the quality of the silence between them, and for several weeks after that the shift remained, hanging in the air between them like something that needed to be addressed, like the eastern end of the barn roof that they both knew needed fixing and kept not quite getting to. And then August came, and with August came a man named Dale Kessler. Dale Kessler was from the same county in Missouri as Stephen, which was either a coincidence or a complication depending on how you looked at it, and he arrived in Harlan with a surveying crew and a commission from the territorial government to reassess land boundaries along the Cimarron drainage. He was 35 years old, well-dressed by frontier standards, and he had the bright, forward-leaning energy of a man who understood leverage in all its forms. He came out to the Cimarron property to conduct his survey, which was legitimate, and he stayed for supper, which was an imposition. And over the course of that supper, he managed to convey to Etta, without ever saying it directly, that he found her impressive and that he believed she was wasting herself in an ambiguous arrangement with a man who had clearly not been willing to commit to her in any formal sense. Etta did not like Dale Kessler. She found him precisely the kind of man she had spent her life being wary of, the kind who wrapped self-interest in the language of concern and presented his own agenda as advice given for your benefit. But she also found, to her shame, that some of what he said landed somewhere tender, because the question of formality, the question of what she was to Stephen and what Stephen was to her, and what either of them was willing to say about it out loud, had been living in her like a splinter she could not reach. That night, after Kessler was gone, she asked Stephen directly what they were to each other. The question hung in the lamplight between them, and she watched his face for what felt like a very long time, and what she saw was not coldness. It was not indifference. What she saw was a man navigating something complicated, trying to find the right words and finding them too slowly. She did not wait for him to find them. She said she needed to know because she could not continue to live in a state of permanent uncertainty, and that if he did not have an answer for her after 7 months of working side by side and sharing everything short of a name, then perhaps the answer was already given. He said her name. Just that. Etta, with a particular quality of anguish in it that she was too wounded to receive. She stood up from the table and walked to her room and closed the door, and in the morning she packed her carpetbag and left before he was awake. She had told herself, walking away down the Cimarron Road in the gray dawn of a September morning in 1876, that she was making the right decision, that a man who could not speak his feelings plainly after 7 months was a man who would never speak them, and that waiting for him to find words he did not have was a form of punishment she was not willing to inflict on herself. She had told herself this every day for 7 years, and she had done it with enough repetition and conviction that it had become something she believed, most of the time, in the way you can believe something that you have chosen to believe through sheer discipline of will. And then she had found the deed. 3 weeks after she had walked away, he had gone to the land office and put her name on it. She had spent 7 years building a new life in Harlan, because she had not had anywhere else to go, and because Harlan, despite its complications, was the place she had chosen when she was choosing for herself. She had eventually saved enough to purchase a small house on the south end of town. She had taken in sewing and later expanded to a proper dressmaking establishment, which by 1883 was the most successful business of its kind between Harlan and Santa Fe. She was respected. She was independent. She was, by every external measure, doing well. She was also, if she was honest with herself in the particular honesty of 3 in the morning, deeply lonely in a way that success and independence could not address, because the loneliness was specific. It was shaped like a particular person. It had dark eyes and rough hands and a dry, quiet sense of humor, and a habit of saying her name with more weight in it than other people managed. She had not seen Stephen Abbott in 7 years. She knew he was still on the Cimarron. She knew this because Harlan was a small town, and information moved through it the way water moved through limestone, inevitably and without permission. She knew he had expanded the herd. She knew he had rebuilt the eastern end of the barn. She knew he had not married. She had tried not to know this last thing, but it was the nature of certain knowledge that it finds you regardless of your efforts to avoid it. Now she was rolling up the deed with the two names on it and putting it in her coat pocket and walking out of the Harlan County land office into the red afternoon light. And she was thinking about 14 miles of trail and what waited at the end of them. And she was terrified in a way she had not been since she had left Kansas with $4.60 and nothing else to her name. She rode. The trail to the Cimarron ran south from Harlan through a stretch of open grassland that was turning the particular pale gold of late summer, and the sky above it was the deep, clean blue that you only got in the territory at this time of year, and under any other circumstances she would have found it beautiful. She did not find it beautiful now. She found it long, and the horse beneath her, a dependable bay named Solomon that she had owned for 3 years, seemed to sense her agitation and moved with a steadiness that felt almost sympathetic. She tried to organize her thoughts during the ride. She was good at organization, good at taking complicated problems and reducing them to their component parts and addressing each part in sequence. Her dressmaking business ran on this skill, but the problem of Stephen Abbott did not reduce. Every time she tried to break it into its elements, the elements collapsed back into one thing, which was that he had put her name on the deed 3 weeks after she had left, and that this was either the most meaningful thing anyone had ever done for her or it was something else entirely, something practical or legal or motivated by considerations she did not understand. And she needed to know which one it was before she could do anything at all with the information. The Cimarron came into view at the edge of the long slope, the cottonwoods glinting silver in the afternoon light. And then the house, which was larger than she remembered, or perhaps the same size but more settled now, more permanent, the way things get when 7 years of care have been applied to them. The barn had been extended. There was a second structure she did not recognize, a low building that might have been a smokehouse or a storage shed. The kitchen garden was no longer weeds. She pulled Solomon to a stop at the edge of the property and sat for a moment, breathing. Then she rode in. He was at the well, which was the same well she remembered, drawing water, and he straightened when he heard the horse and turned. And for a moment he simply stood there with the bucket in his hand, and she sat on Solomon and looked at him, and the 7 years compressed and expanded simultaneously in the silence between them. He was 40 now, or close to it. He had aged in the ways that outdoor men in the territory aged, which was thoroughly and honestly, the sun and the wind having done their careful work on his face. His hair had some gray in it at the temples. He was larger through the shoulders than she remembered, or perhaps she had forgotten the particular physical fact of him over 7 years of deliberate not thinking about it. He looked like a man who had worked hard and continued to work hard and had organized himself around that fact. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, which was directly and without pretense, and she found it infuriating that after 7 years this particular quality of his attention still did something to her equilibrium. She dismounted. She tied Solomon to the fence post with more focus than the task required, giving herself the seconds. Then she turned and walked toward him, and she pulled the deed from her coat pocket and she held it out to him. He looked at it. His expression shifted in a way she could not fully read, but she saw something in it that looked like a man who had been waiting for something for a very long time and was not sure whether to be relieved or afraid that it had finally arrived. "You want to tell me what this is?" she said. His voice, when it came, was the same voice. That was the thing that undid her slightly, the fact that it was exactly the same measured tone with the same quiet weight in it. "I expect you know what it is," he said. "I know what it says," she said. "I want to know why." He set the bucket down. He did this slowly, like a man being careful about his movements around something unpredictable. Then he looked at her again and said, "Because it was yours." "It was not mine," she said, and she heard the anger in her own voice and let it be there. "I left. I walked off this property on a September morning in 1876, and I did not look back. And you know I did not look back, so you cannot tell me you put my name on a deed because the property was mine." "The property was not mine. I gave it up." "You did not give it up," he said. You left because I failed you. Those are not the same thing." The words landed on her like stones. She stood in the dooryard of the house she had helped build, with the Cimarron running quiet and dark behind the cottonwoods and the afternoon light turning everything to copper and gold. And she looked at Stephen Abbott and she felt 7 years of careful architecture beginning to buckle. "You failed me," she said carefully. "That is the word you are using." "Yes," he said, without any qualifier or escape route. "Just yes. And yet you waited 3 weeks after I left to go record my name." "I wanted to do it before you left," he said. "I had intended to do it. I had thought about it for months. And when you asked me that question at the table and I could not find the right words fast enough, you walked away, and I understood that I had already failed you in the larger sense, and the deed was—" He stopped. He looked down at his hands. "The deed was the one thing I could still do that was right. Why didn't you come after me?" The question was out before she could stop it, and it hurt on its way out, hurt in the specific way that questions do when they have been locked up for 7 years and finally find air. "I did," he said quietly. She stared at him. "I never saw you. You had gone to Mrs. Hobart's. I came to town the morning after. Clara Hobart told me you had specifically asked that I not be told where you were." He said this without bitterness, just stated it the way he stated most things, as a plain fact. "I respected that. I did not think you wanted to be pursued by the man who had just hurt you." Etta thought about Clara Hobart, who had indeed known where she was those first few days, who had been protective and loyal and had not told her that Stephen had come, who had made a decision on her behalf that Etta was not sure she had the right to make. But Mrs. Hobart had been dead for 4 years, and there was no point in being angry at a dead woman. "And then you just put my name on the deed and went on with your life," she said. "I put your name on the deed because whatever happened between us did not change the fact that you had earned that land," he said. "You spent a year working it alongside me. You built that garden. You helped me put in the second fence line. You kept the accounts for the first full year, which was the first time the accounts had ever balanced. The land remembered you even if you chose not to return to it." He paused. "I kept thinking you might want to come back for it, not for me, just for the land, as something that was yours." "And if I had come back for it?" she asked, voice quieter now. Something changed in his face. The careful neutrality he had been maintaining since she arrived developed a crack in it, and through the crack she could see something that looked uncomfortably like the thing she had been carrying around in her own chest for 7 years. "Then I would have been here," he said. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. It had less anger in it and considerably more weight. Etta looked down at the deed in her hand, and then up at the house, and then at the cottonwoods and the river, and she thought about 7 years of not coming back. 7 years of telling herself she was fine. 7 years of the dressmaking shop and the house on the south end of Harlan, and the life she had built with deliberate, systematic care. The life that was entirely hers and also entirely missing something she could not replace with success or independence or the respect of her neighbors. "I have a business," she said. "I have built something." "I know," he said. "The whole county knows. You are the finest dressmaker between here and Santa Fe, and you have made yourself into something that has nothing to do with me or anyone else." He said this with unmistakable pride, without a trace of wounded ego in it, and the pride she heard in his voice was somehow harder to absorb than anger would have been. "I am not suggesting you give any of that up." "Then what are you suggesting?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that a red-tailed hawk that had been circling above the south meadow gave up and went somewhere else. Then he said, "I am suggesting that 7 years is a long time to keep a name on a deed without an explanation, and that you deserve the explanation, and you have it now. What you do with it is entirely your choice. It always has been." She folded the deed very precisely and put it back in her coat pocket. "I need to think," she said. He nodded, which she remembered as his particular form of respect, the acknowledgement that thinking was a legitimate activity that deserved time. "You are welcome to stay," he said. "The porch, at least. It is a 14-mile ride back to Harlan in the dark. She looked at the sky. The sun had moved a good deal while they had been talking, and the light was shifting from copper to the deep rose of early evening. She would not make it back to Harlan before dark on Solomon, not comfortably. "I'll stay on the porch," she said. He cooked supper, which surprised her. Not that he could cook, because she had always known that about him, but that he did it without making any kind of event of it. Just went to the kitchen and produced food with the quiet efficiency that characterized everything he did. It was bean soup with salt pork and cornbread, simple and well-made, and they ate it on the porch in the last light, with the Cimarron speaking softly in the background and the first stars emerging above the mesa to the east. They talked. Not about the deed, not about what had been said in the dooryard. They talked the way they had used to talk in the evenings after supper in the old days, ranging over subjects easily, finding the rhythm of two people who are genuinely interested in what the other person thinks. She told him about her dressmaking business, the details of it, the suppliers in Santa Fe, and the challenge of keeping up with fabric orders, and the complicated social navigation of being a woman in business in a town that was not entirely sure how to categorize her. He told her about the cattle operation, the expansion he had managed over 7 years, the seasons that had been hard and the ones that had been generous, the decision to add a second structure for equipment storage. At some point in the middle of all this talking, she became aware that she was not angry anymore. The anger had not resolved so much as exhausted itself, and what was underneath it was something older and quieter and considerably more frightening. She slept in the second room, which was still a room, still furnished with the same bed frame and the same chest of drawers, though the mattress was different, and there was a new quilt that she did not recognize, blue and white, very well made, better made than she expected from a man living alone. She wondered briefly where it had come from, and then decided not to wonder too hard and went to sleep. She woke in the gray morning to the sound of the river and the smell of coffee, and for one long, disoriented moment she thought it was 1876, thought she had not left, and 7 years had not happened, and everything was as it had been. Then the present reassembled itself, and she lay still for a moment, listening to the Cimarron, and looking at the ceiling and thinking about what she was doing. What she was doing was something she had not planned. She had come out here for an explanation, and she had gotten it, and the explanation had not resolved anything. It had opened everything wider, and she was lying in this bed in this house with this deed in her coat pocket, and she did not know what to do next. She was 31 years old. She had a business and a house and a life that she had built herself. She was not going to dismantle any of that for a feeling, even a feeling that had been following her around like a faithful, inconvenient dog for 7 years. She got up and went to the kitchen, and Stephen was at the stove with his back to her, and he turned when she came in and said good morning, and she said good morning, and he poured her coffee without asking, which was exactly what she would have wanted, and handed it to her and went back to the stove. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead," he said, without turning around. "Why didn't you come after me again, after Mrs. Hobart told you I didn't want to see you? You could have come back in a month, in 6 months. You could have written. You knew I was in Harlan." She paused. "Why did you just let it be 7 years?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he turned from the stove and leaned against the counter and looked at her with that direct gaze that had always made her feel simultaneously seen and unguarded. "Because I did not want to be the man who showed up at your door and made you feel like you owed me something," he said. "You left because I could not give you what you needed when you needed it. That was my failure. Coming after you would have put the burden of resolving my failure on you, and that did not seem right." He paused. "I thought about it every month for the first 2 years. And then I started to think that maybe you had made a life that was better than what I could have offered, and that if that was true, then the right thing to do was stay out of it." She stared at him. "You thought you were protecting me. I thought I was respecting you," he corrected gently. "There is a difference." "Yes," she said, "but the result is the same. 7 years of both of us being alone when we did not have to be." The words were out before she had fully processed them, and she watched his face change when he heard them, watched the something behind his eyes become something more visible, more present, and she thought, there it is. There is the thing I saw that night at the table and was too hurt to receive. There is the thing that has been on this property for 7 years, patient as the river, waiting. No, she said before he could respond. I am not saying that as a declaration of anything. I need you to understand that I am still, she pressed her hand briefly to her sternum, a private gesture she had not intended to make. I am still sorting through this. You have to give me time. I have been giving you time for 7 years, he said very quietly, and then immediately added, that was not meant as pressure, that was poorly worded. It was honestly worded, she said. And she found, to her considerable surprise, that she was almost smiling. She went back to Harlan that morning. She needed to be in her shop, needed the familiar surroundings and the work and the sensible ordinary demands of a functioning business to give her space to think. She needed to talk to someone, and the someone she needed to talk to was not available because Mrs. Hobart was dead. But there was a woman named Ruth Castillo who ran the millinery shop 2 doors down and who had become, over the years, the closest thing Etta had to a confidant. Ruth Castillo was 45 and had been married twice, both husbands dead, one to fever and one to a horse accident, and she had survived both losses and emerged from them with a practical and unsentimental understanding of love that Etta found extremely useful. She came over to Etta's shop that afternoon with coffee and sat on the workbench and listened to the whole story, beginning to end, without interruption. When Etta finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You are already in love with him." "I know," Etta said. "Then what exactly are you sorting through?" Ruth asked with the particular directness of a woman who has buried 2 husbands and has no patience for self-deception. "Whether it is wise," Etta said. "It is not wise," Ruth said immediately. "Love is never wise. That is entirely separate from whether you should do it." "He hurt me," Etta said. "He stood there at that table and could not say the words, and I asked him directly and he did not. He was afraid," Ruth said. "Men are afraid in the same ways they have always been afraid, which is poorly and at the wrong moments." She picked up her coffee. "The question is not whether he was afraid. The question is whether he has given you evidence over the course of the time you have known him that he is the kind of man who does right by people when it matters. And it sounds to me like that is precisely the evidence you have been sitting on for the past 7 years without reading it correctly." Etta was quiet for a moment. Outside, the afternoon wind was picking up, rattling the shop sign. "He put my name on the deed," she said. "He put your name on the deed," Ruth agreed. 3 weeks after you left. When there was no possible benefit to him in doing it, when you had made it clear you were gone. He did it because he believed it was right." She set her coffee down. "Etta, I have been married to 2 men. One of them loved me the way Stephen Abbott loved you, quietly and practically and without a great deal of performance, and I did not always appreciate it while I had it. The other one was very good at saying the right words and considerably less reliable about the actual doing of things. I know which one I would choose if I had the choosing over again." Etta thought about this for 3 days. She kept her shop open and saw her clients and did the work, and in the evenings she sat in her house with her lamp and thought about the Cimarron and the cottonwoods, and a man she had not spoken to in 7 years who had been carrying her name on a deed all that time like a private promise to a woman who had gone. On the 4th day she closed the shop at noon and rode back out to the Cimarron. He was mending fence in the south meadow when she arrived, and he saw her coming from a distance and stopped what he was doing and waited, which was characteristic of him. She tied Solomon and walked across the meadow toward him, and the grass was up to her knees, and the sky was the kind of blue that makes you feel small in a good way. She stopped in front of him. "I am not walking away from my business," she said. "I would not ask you to," he said. "And I am not moving out here in any informal capacity again. If I come back to this land, there is going to be a proper arrangement. Not because of what other people think, but because I am not willing to spend another period of time not knowing what I am to you." Something shifted in his face, a kind of loosening, as if something that had been held in tension for a very long time had been permitted to relax. "That is entirely reasonable," he said. "I am also not rushing anything," she said. "It has been 7 years. I am not undoing that in an afternoon." "I understand," he said. "But I am willing," she said, and then she stopped, because saying the whole thing felt like too much at once, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the south meadow of the Cimarron property lay quiet and golden around them. "Willing to try," she said. He stepped forward then, carefully, the way he did everything, and he took her hand, and her hand was not small in his hand. She was not a small woman, and she had never wanted to be. But there was something about the specific way he held it, not possessively, but as if it were something he had been trying to hold carefully and correctly for a very long time, and finally had the opportunity, that made something in her chest stop being armored and simply become open. "I have been in love with you since January of 1876, he said. "Since the morning you told me the eastern fence posts were setting crooked, and you were right, and I had to redig 7 holes in frozen ground. I was angry about the fence posts and completely in love with you at the same time, and I could not figure out what to do with both of those things simultaneously." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, but it came out of her, real and full, the kind of laughter that comes from the release of something. "You picked an interesting moment to tell me," she said. "You picked an interesting moment to come back," he said. They stood in the meadow in the September afternoon, and the Cimarron ran quiet beyond the cottonwoods, and the red-tailed hawk was back, making long, slow circles above the south ridge. And Etta Talmadge decided that 7 years was long enough to be away from something that was yours. The courtship, if it could be called that, was a practical and romantic thing in equal measure. She rode out to the Cimarron on Saturdays and sometimes on Wednesdays, and he came into Harlan on Tuesdays for supper at the hotel, which had replaced Mrs. Hobart's establishment as the primary dining option in town after Clara's death. They walked. They talked. They argued occasionally, because they were both stubborn people with actual opinions. But the arguments were productive in the way that arguments are when both parties are fundamentally trying to get to the right answer rather than to win. He came to her shop one afternoon in October and stood in the doorway looking at the organized interior, the bolts of fabric on the shelves, the dress forms with their half-finished garments, the work table covered in patterns and measurements, and she watched him take it all in with the same serious attention he brought to everything, and she felt a surge of pride that surprised her with its intensity. "This is a remarkable business," he said. "It is a good business," she said. "I have made it good." "I know," he said. He walked in and looked at the shelves and picked up a bolt of calico and set it down and looked at the dress form nearest him with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "How did you learn the dressmaking?" She told him about Kansas, about her mother, who had been an excellent seamstress, and about how the skill had felt like a burden when she was young because it was what poor women did when they had no other options, and how she had arrived in Harlan with the skill in her hands, and eventually understood it as the one thing her mother had given her that could not be taken away or gambled off or lost to fever. He listened to all of this without interrupting and then said, "Your mother gave you something that saved your life." "She did," Etta said a little thickly. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," he said. "She was practical," Etta said. "She was not demonstrative, but she was someone you could count on." She paused. "She would have liked you, I think." The quiet that followed this was warm rather than heavy, and Etta thought, This is what I have been missing. Not the declarations or the romance in the theatrical sense, but this, the feeling of being truly known by another person, and finding that the knowing is not a danger but a relief." He asked her to marry him in November, on the porch of the Cimarron house on a cold, clear afternoon, with the mountains visible to the north, and the river low and silver below the cottonwoods. He did it simply and directly, which was how he did everything, and he said that he wanted to be her husband and that he wanted to formalize the partnership properly this time, not because of what other people thought, but because he had understood 7 years ago that he had been afraid of the words when she needed them, and he was not willing to be that man again. She said yes. She said it without ceremony, without tears, just the single clear word. And then she looked at him, and he looked at her. And there was something in the quality of that look that was entirely private and also entirely entire. The look of two people who have arrived at something after a journey long enough that the arriving feels like its own kind of country. They were married in December of 1883 in the Harlan County church, which was a small wooden building that smelled of pine and lamp oil and the particular dust of high desert winters. Ruth Castillo attended as Etta's witness and nearly wept, which she maintained afterward had been entirely due to the cold air. The minister, a man named Reverend Paul Elias, who had been in Harlan for 6 years and had heard more complicated stories than most, performed the service with genuine warmth and no unnecessary embellishment. The deed was already in both their names. Had been for 7 years. That fact had not required amendment. They worked out the question of the business and the house in Harlan, and the land on the Cimarron over the course of several honest conversations, which produced a solution that suited both of them. She kept the dressmaking shop, which continued to operate under her management, and she hired a young woman named Beatrice Flynn as an assistant to manage the Harlan side of things on the days when Etta was not in town. They lived primarily at the Cimarron, where Etta spent her mornings and her evenings and her Sundays, and she rode to town 3 days a week to run the shop herself. It was not a conventional arrangement, but the people of Harlan had given up on expecting conventional things from Etta Talmadge some years ago, and the new designation of Etta Abbott, which she used for social purposes while continuing to operate the business under Talmadge, satisfied whatever remaining appetite the town had for categorization. The first spring on the Cimarron together was extraordinary. It had the quality of a thing both familiar and entirely new, the landscape she had known before and the person she had known before, but experienced now from inside rather than through the careful glass of restraint. She planted the kitchen garden with the thoroughness that 7 years of imagining it had produced, and Stephen built new raised beds along the south wall of the house that caught the afternoon sun and allowed her to extend the growing season by several weeks. They argued in February about the cattle operation, specifically about whether expanding the herd made more sense than investing in additional acreage to the north, and the argument lasted 3 days and was eventually resolved by a spreadsheet of Etta's devising that demonstrated clearly that the acreage was the better investment, which Stephen acknowledged without defensiveness, and with the particular respect of a man who appreciates being shown he is wrong by someone who has done the work. "You are maddening," he told her one evening not unpleasantly. "You are too slow with your numbers," she told him. "I am aware," he said, and kissed her in the particular way he had developed of kissing her, which was always slightly more direct than she expected, as if the careful man who organized everything else had decided that certain things did not require management. In March, she discovered she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning over coffee, standing in the kitchen with the early light coming through the east window, and she watched him absorb the information with the same focused attention he gave to everything important. Then something happened to his face that she had never seen before, a kind of complete defenselessness, all the careful management gone, just the feeling itself visible and unguarded. He set down his coffee and came to her and held her, not dramatically, just firmly and quietly, and she felt his hands on her back and his breath against her hair and the Cimarron running outside beyond the cottonwoods, and she thought, I almost did not have this. She thought, 7 years. She thought, never again. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly, his voice close to her ear. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Considerably," he said. Also, he pulled back enough to look at her, and she could see it on his face, the thing that had no sufficient word. "I'm also the furthest thing from frightened." She laughed and pressed her forehead briefly against his shoulder and then straightened, because she was not a woman who lingered in sentiment past its natural duration. "We should talk about the practical arrangements," she said. "We should," he agreed, with the faint smile she had come to understand as one of his primary expressions of affection. "Shall I get a piece of paper?" Their son was born in October of 1884, delivered by Dr. Haas from Harlan at the Cimarron house, a large and vigorous baby who announced himself with impressive authority and showed from his first hours a determined interest in his own agenda. They named him George, after Stephen's father, a name that Etta had approved after meeting the elder Abbott in a letter that Stephen read to her, with the particular mix of pride and exasperation that characterized his feelings about the older man. George Abbott took his first steps at 11 months, which Etta recorded in the household accounts book she maintained with the same precision she applied to the shop finances, noting the date and the number of steps and the subsequent fall and the complete lack of distress with which the child received the fall and immediately tried again. She noted in the margin beside this entry, "He is his father's son." Beatrice Flynn, who was managing the Harlan shop with increasing confidence, came out to the Cimarron to see the baby and pronounced him beautiful and extremely opinionated, both of which were accurate. Beatrice was 22 now and had been working for Etta for 2 years and had become indispensable in the way that genuinely competent people become indispensable, not because they make themselves necessary through dependency, but because they make everything better through real skill. Etta had begun paying her a proper wage plus a percentage of profits, which was the arrangement Mrs. Hobart had never offered her and which she had always felt the injustice of. She was not going to replicate that injustice with someone in her own employ. The second year of their marriage had a rhythm that was entirely different from the first, layered now with the particular texture of life with a small child, which was exhausting and funny and occasionally alarming in ways that no practical preparation had adequately covered. Stephen proved to be a father of the hands-on variety, which did not surprise Etta in the least, because he was constitutionally incapable of being at the edge of a practical challenge without engaging with it directly, and a small person learning to be a person in the world was the most consequential practical challenge she had ever seen him face. She watched him one evening with George, the baby sitting on the kitchen floor with a collection of wooden blocks that Stephen had made during the final weeks of her pregnancy, and Stephen sitting cross-legged on the floor beside him with the same focused attention he gave to fence posts and cattle records and everything else that mattered. George was stacking the blocks with great seriousness and knocking them down with greater satisfaction, and Stephen watched each cycle of construction and demolition with apparent genuine interest, occasionally adding a block or steadying a wobbling tower, and Etta stood in the doorway and felt something so complete and warm in her chest that it was almost painful. She thought, "I nearly missed this. I spent 7 years nearly missing this." She thought, "I am not going to be a person who wastes the present on grief about the past." The following spring brought news from California. Her brother James, whom she had not seen since Kansas in 1874, wrote to say that he was doing well, that he had married a woman named Helen, and that he had recently heard through a mutual acquaintance that his sister was married and living on the Cimarron. The letter was both touching and slightly maddening in the way that letters from people who have been absent are always slightly maddening, full of the easy warmth of reconnection without any acknowledgement of the years of silence. But James was her brother, and she had missed him, and she wrote back a long letter describing her life in thorough and affectionate detail, including the business and the marriage and the baby, and over the following year they established a correspondence that was imperfect and irregular but real. Ruth Castillo came for supper one evening in the spring of 1885 and made pointed observations about how the Cimarron property had improved since Etta's arrival, which were intended as compliments to Etta and were also simply true. The kitchen garden was impressive. The house had been expanded by one room, a proper study with bookshelves that Stephen had built from timber milled at the new sawmill outside of Harlan. The cattle operation was running more efficiently than it had in years. The accounts were balanced and then some. "You look well," Ruth told her privately, while Stephen was occupied with George on the other side of the room. "Not just well, you look like yourself." "I feel like myself," Etta said. "I feel more like myself than I have since I was a child." "That is what the right person does," Ruth said simply. Etta thought about this later, lying in the dark with Stephen asleep beside her, and the Cimarron murmuring outside and George quiet in his room. And she thought about the many ways in which she had been not quite herself during the 7 years between leaving and returning. Not broken, not defeated. She had not permitted either of those things, but not complete either. Operating on partial information. Going through the important motions without the one variable that made the whole equation resolve. She had spent 7 years being afraid that coming back would mean giving something up. She had been wrong. Coming back had not required her to give anything up. She had given nothing up and gained everything, which was the best possible kind of accounting. She also thought, in the quiet of that dark, about the deed. About the fact that it had been sitting in a filing cabinet in the Harlan County Land Office for 7 years with both their names on it, patiently waiting. She thought about a man going to a land office 3 weeks after the woman he loved had walked away, and putting her name on something permanent, and then going back to his life and doing the right thing for 7 years without asking for anything in return. That was not a small thing. That was, she thought, about the largest thing one person could do for another in the absence of any guarantee of reciprocation. To say, in the most practical and binding language available, "You are real to me. What you built is real. You have a place here even if you do not come back to it." She turned in the dark and put her hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, just the warmth of her palm flat against his back, not to wake him but to establish that she was here. He shifted slightly in sleep, a small unconscious movement toward her hand. She went asleep content. George was walking with total confidence by February of 1885, and had developed a vocabulary of approximately 40 words, most of which he applied with impressive inaccuracy and great enthusiasm. He called Solomon the horse by a name that sounded like Solly, and had formed a devoted attachment to the milk cow, whose actual name was Nora, and whom George called Boo with unshakable conviction. He called Stephen Papa and Etta Mama, and occasionally reversed these when in a hurry, which neither parent corrected because the error was too genuine to deserve correction. In the summer of 1885, an event occurred that briefly threatened the comfortable new architecture of their life. A man named Prescott arrived in Harlan from Santa Fe with a commission from a land development company based in Denver, Colorado, looking to acquire large parcels along the Cimarron drainage for a proposed irrigation scheme. He approached Stephen directly, offering a price for the Cimarron property that was, by any honest assessment, generous. Stephen came home that evening and told Etta about the offer with the straightforward information sharing that characterized his communication, making no recommendation and expressing no preference, laying it out for both of them to consider. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said. "I am asking what you want," she said firmly, "not what you think I want." He looked at the wall for a moment, which was his version of gathering himself. Then, "I do not want to sell. This land is—" He stopped and she could see him looking for words. "It is what I built. It is what we built. The offer is good money, but money is not the point of this place." "No," she agreed, "it is not. But if you—" he began. "I do not want to sell either," she said. "I want to say no to Mr. Prescott, and I want to expand the north acreage like we talked about in February, and I want to plant winter wheat again this year, and I want to tell that Denver company that the Cimarron is not for sale." He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to understand as his version of being completely certain about something. "All right," he said. They declined the offer in writing, which Etta drafted herself with the precision and firmness that her years of running a business had honed to a fine edge. Prescott came back twice. Twice, they declined. The third time he raised the offer by 30%. Etta had Stephen tell him the land was not for sale at any price, which was both absolutely true and an effective end to the conversation. The North Acreage purchase went through in October of 1885, adding 11 acres of good grassland to the Cimarron property, which brought the total to 53 acres and gave them the winter grazing range they had been lacking. Stephen handled the cattle logistics, and Etta handled the financial arrangements, and the whole process was completed with the smooth efficiency of two people who have been working together long enough to have developed a functional shared language. Their second child was born in the spring of 1886, another boy, whom they named Daniel, after Etta's father in spite of that man's considerable failings, because Etta had decided some time ago that honoring the connections of the past did not require approving of everything those connections had involved. Daniel was smaller than George at birth but equally vigorous, and George, now 18 months old and in possession of strong opinions about everything in his world, regarded the new arrival with a combination of intense curiosity and territorial suspicion that gradually, over the following weeks, resolved into protective enthusiasm. She watched George watching Daniel one afternoon, both children on a blanket in the kitchen garden in the warm spring light, George offering Daniel a fistful of grass with great seriousness, while Daniel lay on his back and examined the sky with the focused concentration of someone encountering sky for the first time. She felt the completeness again, the whole and balanced weight of a life that was genuinely full. Beatrice Flynn had by this point effectively taken over the day-to-day operation of the Harlan dressmaking shop, with the confidence of a woman who has internalized the standards of a demanding teacher and made them her own. Etta went to Harlan twice a week now rather than 3 times, maintaining her creative involvement in the business, but delegating the management to Beatrice with the genuine trust of a person who has learned the difference between managing people and controlling them. Beatrice had also, in the natural course of the past 2 years, become involved with a young man named Thomas Reyes, who worked at the Harlan County Surveyor's office, a situation that Etta observed with the particular warm amusement of a person who has been through the relevant territory themselves and recognizes the landmarks. She said nothing and watched Beatrice navigate it with the independence of spirit that Etta had always seen in her and had always respected. The summer of 1886 brought drought, which was the territory's periodic reminder that the land here was generous on its own terms and not yours. The South Fork of the Cimarron ran lower than it had in the years since Etta had been on the property, not dry but thinner, the water clear and reduced, the pools below the Cottonwood Bend shrunken to half their usual depth. The kitchen garden required active irrigation for the first time, and Etta spent an hour each morning running water from the well by hand to the beds, which was hard work but productive, and the garden survived when the dry land crops to the north suffered. Stephen lost 8 head of cattle to the drought and the disease it enabled, which was the kind of loss that a larger operation could absorb, and a smaller one felt directly. He was quiet for several days after the worst of it, not the nighttime quiet of the old days but a working quiet, methodical, going through the accounts and the options with systematic attention. She left him to it for 2 days and then sat down at the table with him and asked to see the numbers and went through them with him, and they made a plan together, which was what they always did with the hard things. "We will be all right," she said, at the end of the accounting. "Yes," he said. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight. "Yes, we will." It was such a simple exchange, so undramatic, just 2 people at a table with a ledger book between them and 2 children asleep in the next room, and the Cimarron low outside in the drought summer. But she thought afterward that this was what she had wanted all along. Not the grand gesture, not the declaration in the meadow, not even the deed with her name on it, though the deed had mattered enormously for reasons she still thought about. What she had wanted, from the very beginning, was this: a person who would sit at the table with her when things were hard and look at the numbers honestly and say, yes, we will be all right, and mean it. The drought broke in August with a week of hard, sustained rain that brought the Cimarron back to its usual depth and turned the grass from brown to green in what seemed like a matter of days. The property recovered. The cattle recovered. The kitchen garden, which had survived on daily hand watering, produced an extraordinary harvest in the dry, cool weeks of early September, and Etta put up more preserved vegetables than she had in any previous year, filling the shelves of the root cellar with jars that caught the lamplight and glowed amber and green and deep red. She found herself, in October of 1886, walking the property alone one afternoon while the children were with Stephen at the barn, and the light was the particular gold of the territory in autumn, and she went down to the south fork of the Cimarron and stood in the shade of the largest cottonwood, the one she had noticed first when Stephen had brought her out here to show her the land in August of 1875, over 11 years ago now. The tree was the same tree, unmistakably, exactly as large and exactly as particular in its angled posture above the bank, and the river ran below it as it always had, and she stood there for a long time listening to it. She had been 23 years old when she had first stood in this spot. She had been running from something and arriving at something simultaneously, the way you always are when you are 23 and the world has been hard and you have decided to try a different direction. She had not known what she was arriving at. She had not known about the deed, or the 7 years, or the 2 children asleep in the root cellar's afternoon, or the man in the barn who had given her the most straightforward and complicated and quietly enormous love she had ever encountered. She thought about her mother, who had died in a Kansas winter before any of this had happened, who had never seen New Mexico, or the Cimarron, or the cottonwoods, or any of the life that had grown up out of those sewing skills she had passed on with her unpretentious, reliable hands. She missed her mother in a way that had softened over years without ever disappearing. She thought her mother would have approved of the kitchen garden. She thought her mother would have liked the root cellar shelves with their amber and green jars. She thought her mother would have recognized Stephen Abbott as a man worth trusting, because her mother had been good at recognizing the difference between men who performed reliability and men who actually had it. She walked back up to the house as the light was going gold-red along the mesa, and she could hear George's voice from the barn, high and enthusiastic, and then Stephen's voice, lower, patient, answering whatever complicated question a 2-year-old had produced. She climbed the porch steps and went inside and began making supper, and when they all came in from the barn 20 minutes later, Stephen with Daniel on his hip and George running ahead to tell her some urgent news about the milk cow, she felt the completeness like a physical thing, solid and warm and entirely, permanently hers. The years that followed were full. George grew into a serious, physically capable boy with his father's directness and his mother's organizational instincts, a combination that his parents found simultaneously useful and somewhat daunting. By the time he was 6, he was helping with genuine barn chores rather than pretend ones, and he had developed a facility with the horses that Stephen observed with quiet satisfaction, and Etta observed with the particular alertness of a mother calculating risk. Daniel was different from his brother in the way that second children are often entirely their own thing, having been liberated from the expectations that landed on the first. He was sociable and funny, and inclined toward elaborate schemes that generally worked out better than they deserved to. And he had a talent for music that appeared to have arrived from nowhere detectable in either parent's family history, and which manifested in an intense relationship with a harmonica that a traveling merchant had sold to Etta in Harlan, and which Daniel had claimed immediately and with great finality. Beatrice Flynn married Thomas Reyes in the spring of 1887, a wedding that Etta attended with Stephen and both boys, and at which Etta's dressmaking skills were displayed to considerable effect, having produced the wedding dress and the dress of the maid of honor, a young woman from the Reyes family who had come from Santa Fe for the occasion. The wedding was a genuinely joyful event, and Etta found herself happy at it in the specific way that people are happy when they see someone they care about arriving at something good. The Harlan dressmaking establishment continued to grow under the joint management of Etta and Beatrice, and by 1888, it had expanded into the adjacent space when the previous tenant vacated, allowing for a proper fitting room and a dedicated work area for the assistant she and Beatrice had hired, a quiet and extraordinarily talented young woman named Maria who had learned sewing from her grandmother in Socorro and had arrived in Harlan looking for work. Stephen expanded the cattle operation methodically over those years, adding to the herd in the good years and consolidating in the harder ones, with the steady accumulation of someone who understands that wealth built on land is built slowly and honestly, or it is not built at all. He also served on the Harlan County Water Committee beginning in 1887, a position that suited his particular combination of practical knowledge about the Cimarron drainage and the patient, empirical approach to conflict resolution that characterized him in all things. The new territory's politics were complicated in ways that required attention. The question of statehood was circulating with increasing seriousness, and with it came all the attendant questions about land rights, water rights, and the legal standing of the various peoples whose presence in the territory preceded the American presence by several centuries. Etta and Stephen had conversations about this that were serious and sustained, informed by the fact that they knew the land they lived on and what it required, and what could be taken from it and what could not. They had neighbors to the south, a family named Yazzie, whose relationship to the land along the Cimarron was older than any deed that had ever been filed in any land office, and whose knowledge of the river's behavior in drought and flood had, more than once, saved Stephen's cattle operation from a wrong decision. They were not naive about the injustices embedded in the territory's history, and they were not willing to simply look away from them in the comfortable direction of their own prosperity. In 1889, Etta was 37, and Stephen was 42, and George was 4, and Daniel was 3. And the Cimarron property was 53 acres of working, productive, well-maintained land, and the dressmaking establishment was the most successful business of its kind in that part of the territory, and everything was, by any honest accounting, more than good. She found the deed again that fall, not in the land office this time but in her own papers, reorganizing the household documents with the systematic attention she brought to such tasks every few years. The original recording from September of 1876 had been superseded by various amendments and additions over the years, but she had kept it, folded in a separate envelope at the back of the document box, the first deed with both their names on it, filed unilaterally by a man 3 weeks after the woman he loved had walked away. She brought it to him that evening, held it out across the kitchen table. He looked at it, and then at her with a question in his eyes. "I just wanted you to know I kept it," she said. He took it from her hand and looked at it for a moment, the 2 names, the date, the recorded particulars of 42 acres on the South Fork of the Cimarron. His expression was the same unguarded one she had seen when she told him about Daniel, all the management gone, just the thing itself. "I did not know you had found it until you rode out here with it in September of 1883, he said. "Those 7 years after I filed it I used to think about you finding it sometimes. I thought maybe someday you would." He folded it again along its original creases. "I am glad you found it." "I am glad I found it too," she said. "I am glad I was angry enough to ride 14 miles about it." He smiled, the full smile that she had been collecting and cataloging for years now. "You are the most usefully angry person I have ever known," he said. Useful, she repeated with theatrical offense. Productively angry, he amended. Better, she said. She reached across the table and took the deed back from him and held it between both hands, the paper soft now with age and handling, the ink still clear. The name still plain. Etta Talmadge. Stephen Abbott. 42 acres on the South Fork of the Cimarron River. The deed was not why she had stayed. The deed was not even why she had come back, not entirely. She had come back because she was honest with herself, eventually, and honesty had pointed her where she needed to go. She had stayed because what she found when she got there was exactly what she had understood in the most careful and private part of herself that it would be. But the deed mattered. It mattered because of what it had meant when he filed it, 3 weeks after she had gone, when there was nothing to be gained from it and everything honest to be acknowledged. It had been his way of saying what he had failed to say at the table. You are real to me. You were always real to me. I am afraid of the words, but I am not afraid of the action. And the action is the truest thing I know how to do. She put the deed back in its envelope, and put the envelope back in the document box, and closed the box and went to make coffee, because it was evening and they had accounts to review, and the children would need putting to bed in an hour, and the Cimarron was running outside in the dark beyond the cottonwoods, as it always had, and as it would continue to do long after all the names on all the deeds had passed into the earth that they had lived on. She made the coffee and brought 2 cups to the table and sat down across from him, and he looked up from the accounts with the expression she knew better than she knew her own face, and she thought, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I have been exactly where I was supposed to be for 6 years now, she thought. It took me 7 years to find out what he had done, and it will take me the rest of my life to be worthy of it, and I intend to spend every single day of the rest of my life trying. Ready? She said, and gestured at the accounts. Ready, he said. She pulled the ledger toward her and uncapped her pen, and they began. Outside, the Cimarron ran on in the dark, carrying the cold water down from the mountains and through the cottonwoods, and past the property that bore both their names, patient and permanent and entirely indifferent to the years, moving always forward, as rivers do, in the direction of everything that was yet to come. And in that kitchen, in the warm circle of lamplight, with 2 boys asleep in the next room and the smell of coffee, and the scratching of a pen moving through columns of numbers, Etta Abbott, born Talmadge, who had arrived in New Mexico territory with $4.60, and the particular determination of a woman who has decided to build something that cannot be taken from her, added a note to the bottom of the October 1889 accounts in her precise and careful hand. The note said, "This year was good. All years going forward will be good. We will make them so." She did not show it to him that night. But he found it, as he always found the things she wrote in the margins of the accounts, and the following morning at breakfast he read it and looked up and found her watching him over her coffee cup, and the expression on his face was the entire history of everything, the meadow and the table, and the 14 miles of riding, and the 7 years and the deed, and all of it, compressed into the simple present tense of 2 people who have arrived, against considerable odds, at the place they were always supposed to be. Yes, he said simply. Yes, she agreed. The Cimarron ran on outside, and the territory spread its enormous sky above the cottonwoods, and the morning came in through the east window gold and clean and entirely new.